In the year 2000, Iraq made a decision that almost nobody noticed at first. They announced their oil would no longer be sold in US dollars. Instead, they wanted to sell it in euros. Now that might sound like a small change, just switching one currency for another, like getting paid in euros instead of dollars. Not exactly the kind of thing you would expect to start a global crisis or a war. Some analysts at the time basically shrugged. Okay, Iraq wants euros. So what? And honestly, that sounds reasonable. But the reaction that followed was strangely tense. Financial markets started watching closely. Western governments suddenly looked uneasy. And only a few years later, the United States invaded Iraq. Now, of course, no one officially said these two things were connected. But the more I looked into it, the stranger the whole story felt. Why would selling oil in a different currency become such a serious issue? Because the deeper I went, the more it seemed like this decision had touched something much bigger, something hidden inside the global financial system. And that was the moment I first came across a concept that almost nobody talks about: the petrodollar. And if you don't understand that system, you will never fully understand why tensions between the United States and Iran keep returning again and again. So I started with a simple question: why does oil matter so much? At first, the answer seems obvious. Oil powers cars. It fuels airplanes. It moves cargo ships across entire oceans. But the deeper I looked, the stranger it became, because oil isn't just fuel. Oil is inside plastics, inside fertilizers, inside chemicals used to make thousands of everyday products: your phone, your clothes. Even modern farming depends on it, which means something surprising happens. If oil suddenly disappeared tomorrow, large parts of the modern economy would simply stop working. Factories, transportation, food production, almost everything. And that is when one strange realization hits you. Oil isn't just another commodity. It is closer to something else: the fuel of the entire global economy. Everything runs on it. Now here is where the story gets strange. Oil is produced in a few specific regions of the world, places like the Middle East, but it is consumed everywhere: Europe, Asia, North America. Everyone needs it. So naturally, you would expect countries to trade oil in all kinds of currencies: euros, yen, maybe even their own money. But that is not what happened. Instead, almost all oil in the world is traded in just one currency: the US dollar. Not euros, not yen, not yuan. Just dollars. And the first time I realized that, I had a very simple question. How did that happen? How did the world's most important resource end up tied to one country's money? To answer that, we have to go back to the end of World War II, because that is where this story really begins. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to the final years of World War II. In 1944, while the war was still raging, delegates from 44 countries traveled to a large hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire. The place was called Bretton Woods. Inside that hotel, economists, politicians, and diplomats argued for weeks, sometimes deep into the night, because the world economy had just been shattered by war. Currencies were unstable, trade was collapsing, and nobody trusted anyone else's money. So the question they were trying to answer was simple: how do you rebuild the entire global financial system? At that moment, one country stood above the rest: the United States. Its factories were untouched, its economy was booming, and most importantly, America controlled about 2/3 of the world's gold, which meant something very important. If any country could anchor a new global system, it was the United States. So the solution they designed was surprisingly simple. Most countries would tie their currencies to the US dollar, and the US dollar rates would be tied to gold. $35 for 1 ounce. That was the promise. In theory, it was a beautifully elegant system. As long as everyone trusted the dollar, everything worked. And for a while, it did. Global trade expanded, economies recovered, and the dollar quietly became the most powerful currency on earth. But systems like this only work as long as everyone believes the promise. And by the late 1960s, that belief started to crack. The United States was spending enormous amounts of money. Wars were expensive, government programs were expanding, and more dollars were flowing into the global economy. Soon foreign governments started asking a very uncomfortable question. What if the United States didn't actually have enough gold to back all those dollars? By 1971, the pressure became impossible to ignore. So President Richard Nixon went on national television and made an announcement. He said, "I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold." Temporarily. Brief pause. The gold window never reopened. And just like that, the system created at Bretton Woods collapsed overnight, which created a new problem for the entire world, because if the dollar was no longer backed by gold, why would anyone still need it? And the answer to that question would soon emerge from somewhere unexpected: the oil markets. When Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, the dollar suddenly had a problem. For the first time in modern history, the world's most important currency was no longer backed by gold. No gold, no silver, nothing, just paper. Which raised a dangerous question. Why would the rest of the world keep using it? Because if countries stopped using dollars, the entire system the United States had built after World War II could start to unravel. So Washington needed a new anchor, something powerful enough to replace gold. And, strangely enough, the answer appeared in the middle of a crisis: oil. In the early 1970s, the Middle East erupted again. War broke out, and several oil-producing countries decided to punish the West. They cut oil exports, prices exploded, energy shortages spread, gas lines formed across America. Suddenly, the entire world realized something. Modern economies could not function without oil. Oil was not just another commodity, it was the fuel of the global economy. And inside Washington, some people were watching this crisis very carefully. One of them was Henry Kissinger. America's national security advisor. Kissinger reportedly believed something very simple: control oil, and you control nations. So the United States approached Saudi Arabia, the largest oil exporter on earth. A quiet agreement began to take shape. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil in US dollars, not euros, not yen, not gold, just dollars. In return, the United States would provide military protection and security guarantees to the Saudi kingdom. Soon, other oil-producing countries followed the same model, and without most people noticing, a new global system quietly emerged. From that moment on, if a country wanted oil, it needed dollars. And since every country needed oil, well, you can probably see where this is going. Gold was no longer necessary. Oil had taken its place. The system became known as the Petrodollar, and for decades it helped keep the US dollar at the center of the global economy. But systems like this rarely last forever. And recently, something about this arrangement has started to shift, which might explain why the world economy suddenly feels so unstable again. So, if the petrodollar system has kept the dollar at the center of the global economy for nearly 50 years, why does it suddenly feel like something is beginning to shift? Part of the answer has to do with one country, China. Over the past 2 decades, China has become the largest energy importer in the world. Its factories run on oil, its supply chains run on oil, its economic growth runs on oil. But there is one small problem. Most of that oil is priced in dollars, which means something very simple. If China wants energy, China needs dollars. And that creates a strange dependency, because the same country China is competing with for global influence also controls the currency China needs to buy energy. Not exactly a comfortable position, so over the past few years, Beijing has started experimenting with something different, buying oil using Chinese yuan, encouraging energy exporters to accept payments outside the dollar system, building alternative financial networks, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, very quietly. Xi Jinping once described the broader moment in a rather confident way. The East is rising, and the West is declining. Now, whether or not that prediction is true, one thing is clear. If oil can be traded in currencies other than dollars, then the system built in the 1970s begins to face a new kind of pressure. But here's the strange part. Even with all these changes, the dollar still dominates global energy markets. Which raises another question. If the petrodollar system is still largely intact, why do global tensions keep rising around the places where oil flows? And to understand that, we need to look at one narrow strip of water in the Middle East because a surprising amount of the world's energy passes through it every single day. To understand that, we need to look at a very narrow stretch of water, the Strait of Hormuz. At first glance, it doesn't look like much, just a thin passage between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. But every day, something enormous moves through this corridor. Oil tankers, huge ones, some of them longer than 4 football fields. And there are a lot of them. Roughly 1/5 of all oil traded on Earth passes through this strait every single day, which makes this arguably the most important piece of water on the planet, a place most people couldn't find on a map. Now imagine what happens if that narrow passage suddenly stops working, not for months, even for a few days. Oil supply drops, energy prices spike, shipping costs surge, inflation spreads, stock markets panic, because modern economies run on energy, and energy still runs on oil, which is why this small stretch of water is watched constantly. Warships patrol it, satellites monitor it, intelligence agencies track every tanker that moves through, and occasionally, Iran reminds the world how fragile this route is. An Iranian commander once said it bluntly, "If Iran cannot export its oil, no one will." Now, whether Iran would actually do that is another question, because blocking Hormuz would trigger consequences for almost everyone involved, including Iran itself. But here's the strange part. The threat doesn't actually need to happen. The mere possibility is enough to shake markets around the world, and that is why a narrow strip of water in the Middle East can move oil prices, currencies, and stock markets thousands of miles away. But this raises a deeper question, because if energy routes are this powerful, then what happens when conflict starts to disrupt them? And more importantly, who actually benefits when oil markets suddenly become unstable? So here's the strange part. When oil markets become unstable, most countries panic. Importers panic, governments panic, central banks panic. But the United States often reacts a little differently, because oil is not just energy. For decades, it has also been tied to the world's money system. Since the 1970s, most global oil trade has been priced in US dollars, which creates a rather unusual situation. When oil prices rise, countries suddenly need a lot more dollars. And when the world needs dollars, those dollars tend to flow back into the United States, often through US Treasury bonds. Now, this didn't happen by accident. After the oil crisis of the 1970s, Washington reached a quiet agreement with Saudi Arabia. Oil would be sold in dollars, and the revenue from that oil would often be invested back into American financial markets. It created a strange loop. Oil flows out, dollars flow in, and the system keeps reinforcing itself, which means something unusual. The world's most important commodity is tied to one country's currency. Henry Kissinger once said something rather blunt. Control oil and you control nations. Now, that may sound dramatic, maybe even a little suspicious, but the pattern is hard to ignore because energy moves the global economy, and money usually follows energy, which means when oil markets shake, financial power can shift with them. Currencies move, capital moves, entire markets reprice themselves, and sometimes systems that were built around those flows don't collapse during shocks. They absorb them, and occasionally, they even become stronger, which might explain something curious. Over the past 50 years, major oil crises have often ended up strengthening the global role of the dollar. And that's why tensions between the United States and Iran are rarely just about geopolitics. They sit directly on top of one of the most important oil routes on Earth, and the system that prices that oil in dollars. But this raises two other questions. First, if a war between the United States and Iran ever really happened, would either side actually want a decisive victory? Because in geopolitics, sometimes a conflict is more useful than winning it. And second, could a conflict like this also have economic consequences, even consequences for something as enormous as the national debt of the United States? If you want to explore those two questions further, you might want to watch these previous videos. Why the US and Iran don't want to win this war, and how Trump is using the US-Iran war to dump the national debt, because when you put all of these pieces together, this conflict may not just be about war. it may be part of a much larger system that has shaped the global economy for half a century.